Okay, welcome back everyone to our next session here at the Mid-Atlantic Virtual Summit. This session now is a fireside chat entitled Cybersecurity Expert, Microsegmentation, and Zero Trust. This session is being brought to us by our partners at Nutanix. If you haven't yet checked out our virtual booths here at the Mid-Atlantic Virtual Summit, I encourage you to do so and specifically check out Nutanix's booth for some great educational content and more information on their initiatives. For those of you just logging in for the first time this morning, if you would like to submit a question during this fireside chat or during any of our sessions today, please utilize the chat function within the Zoom platform in order to submit your question. All of our sessions today and tomorrow are designed to be interactive, so do not be shy. I assure you our faculty is ready and waiting for your questions. Also, all of our sessions are being recorded and will be available on demand by this evening. So at this time, I would love to welcome on our editor-in-chief, Mark Haglin, who will be moderating this fireside chat. Mark, take it away.
Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for returning and rejoining us. It's my pleasure to have Heather Axworthy from Nutanix join us. Good morning, Heather. How are you?
Great, Mark. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. We are going to be talking about ransomware and segmentation, network segmentation. First, just for a brief moment or two, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own background?
Sure, yes. So my name's Heather Axworthy. I am a cybersecurity expert and security specialist at Nutanix in all things cyber and microsegmentation and zero trust network architectures. I've been in cyber almost 20 years now. Most previously, prior to Nutanix, I was with Palo Alto Networks.
Wonderful. So great to have you. I'm going to begin before I set the lay of the land on the landscape around this topic, by just sharing an interesting little anecdote. Years ago, I interviewed a cybersecurity expert who was a consultant in 3 industries: financial services, the nuclear industry, and healthcare. And I said, "Oh, that's so exciting. What's the difference between healthcare and the nuclear industry?" And she said, "Well, no one that we know could easily get the email address of someone working inside a nuclear power plant, right? But it's very easy to get the email address of someone in a hospital or health system. As I like to say, Dottie in purchasing. You just call up and say, 'Oh, I have a package issue. Who is your purchasing manager?' And they say, 'Oh, her name is Dottie.' And you get the email. You send her a phishing email saying, about your FedEx package that went awry. And Dottie says, 'Wow, my FedEx package went awry. I didn't even know I had one.' And she clicks on it, and 9 months later, they're all locked up. So I just found it fascinating to think about cybersecurity experts in other industries where there aren't as many points of vulnerability as healthcare. So yeah. I thought I would start with that.
Sure.
Yeah. So let's start. I want to set the lay of the land in terms of the landscape around ransomware. But first, could you tell us what ransomware is and why it's so significant?
Sure. So ransomware is a form of malware Trojan that gets onto a network host. Could come in many different ways. Email, clicking on an attachment is usually the easiest way. And once it's installed, it will open itself up. It will disable any endpoint protection that's there, and it will start to move around laterally. It'll start to move around because the goal of ransomware today is to find that data so they can steal it and hold it hostage.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about what does the ransomware landscape look like to you in healthcare in June 2021? We've had so many incidents. It's really been kind of astonishing to follow, but how would you define it right now?
I would define the landscape as, I think it's really critical right now. Ransomware isn't going away. because hackers and hacker groups use it because they know healthcare is a market where they can actually infiltrate pretty easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes it so devastating?
Sure. Well, like I said, it's all about the lateral movement, your blast radius, your attack surface. Most hackers know that hospitals are very large networks and they have lots of different environments such as IoT and PCI and HIPAA and EMR and all, and they want to get in there and then they want to just kind of move laterally. And that's where the damage is really done. There are lots of tools today that can help prevent it when it gets in, but the reality is those tools are great, but there isn't anything that's 100% effective. And as long as there's the human element, there could be somebody could make a change on a network device and it could open up a hole that maybe they didn't know, maybe they don't patch something. My malware, Trojan, ransomware, it gets in, and from there I can just roam where I want because a lot of people protect their north-south with a perimeter based firewall of any flavor, but they don't really look at the internal data center that well. They don't really segment, and you can just ping pong around because usually it's, if you're using like a zone-based firewall, everything intra-zone is automatically allowed. So if you're all in the inside zone, you can just kind of go wherever you want. And that's why ransomware is so devastating. Absolutely. Because a lot of organizations, they don't really think about stopping my lateral movement.
Exactly. So I want to talk about segmentation, but one last question about healthcare and ransomware. Yeah. Talk to us about the value of data in health compared to other industries. That's, it's the old adage: why do thieves rob banks? Because there's
right.
The money is, right?
Well, in healthcare, that's where the money is right now, because an EMR record is worth about $150 on the dark web, as opposed to like a credit card or a social security that's like $1 or $2, $2 to $3. Because EMRs are a plethora of information about someone. If you want to steal someone's identity, you have their entire history in there. Plus, you probably have their payment card info because that's tied in for all the services that they get at the hospital. Their social security number is probably in there, address history, all kinds of different things. So thieves will use it and sell it, not just for identity theft, but for insurance fraud too.
Yes, absolutely. It's so rich, unfortunately.
Rich, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, why would, like, there are two houses on a block and one is the house of kind of like the poor family and it's kind of broken down looking, and then next door is a mansion. Where would you go? You'd go to the mansion store.
Because hackers, they're opportunists, so they're going to go where the opportunity is the easiest.
Absolutely. So let's talk about segmentation and microsegmentation.
Sure.
You and I had talked previously about, there's so many myths and misunderstandings, right? Like we could spend hours on this. Yeah. What do you think most people think segmentation and microsegmentation are, and what are they really?
Most people think that segmentation and any type of microsegmentation is really difficult to do, that it's really expensive, and it's going to take me a long time to do it. And the reality is today, with certain other products out there, that could be the case. But with Nutanix's version of microsegmentation, it's actually very easy to implement right on top of our hypervisor. But microsegmentation in general has always been the last thing companies kind of think about when they're protecting their network, because they're like, well, this is going to take me a long time. It's going to create a lot of resources. I'm going to need a lot of money in professional services to get it working. And maybe it may never get working the way I want it to.
Yeah. One of the things that we found, we've done 2 annual surveys in the last 2 years of our readership and asked them about everything that they're involved in. One of the questions we asked was about segmentation, and we found only about a quarter are doing any kind of segmentation yet. That I find a little discouraging. Does that surprise you?
I'm not surprised by it. It's low, but I'm not surprised today. I think because A lot of organizations, they have less resources, they have less staff, and they look at that as it's a nice to have. I have my perimeter firewall, maybe I have an internal firewall or something. Everybody's on VPN. I have some, like I have an endpoint client on my host. I'm good enough.
Right, exactly. I think maybe in a way, people are still thinking about physical metaphors, right? Like the medieval castle, they have the moat, right?
Right.
And we imagine alligators, although in Europe you didn't have alligators, but we imagined, some dangerous creatures in there. Well, you have the moat, you have a drawbridge, and so you're safe. But that's the wrong visual metaphor, because really a hospital, medical group, or health system is almost more like a spaceship with all sorts of external ports that you could attach to, right? See, I'm a metaphor person. I'm a writer, and so it's different. It's not, having the physical perimeter is definitely not enough. I think some people in our audience know this kind of theoretically, but in practice, they're like, "Well, I'm doing okay," as you just mentioned.
Right.
Tell us about uh, what's involved in creating segmentation and microsegmentation. Just walk us through a little bit of the process. And as you mentioned, it's not as difficult to achieve.
Right, yeah. So typical, when you're thinking about microsegmentation, from the old way of doing it is you think about, oh, here are my VLANs and my segments and my subnets. And I have a lot of them. In hospitals, there are quite a few.
Yeah.
And how am I going to sort of get my arms around this and microsegment? Am I going to have to reinvent the wheel? Am I, going to have to change networking, change segments, maybe replace my whole switching infrastructure in order to do this properly? Who knows? And that actually isn't the case with Nutanix and a lot of other software-defined networking solutions. You kind of think about it. We come about it, instead of looking at VLAN and segment, which is what a lot of people kind of look at, you have to look at it from the application. You have to figure out, where are my critical apps? I don't really care what segment they're on, but where are they? Let me categorize them, get them into groups that I can use then and create policy around those groups.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things, there have been some spectacular ransomware attacks in the last several months of
yeah. And the last few weeks.
Yeah, last few weeks even,
Yeah.
Where they actually, it's such a funny thing, because 20 years ago, everything was about how we have to get onto electronic health records. We have to become electronic. We can't work on paper anymore, and we really can't. But now we're electronic and we're vulnerable. What would you say to organizations that are not the most highly resourced? In other words, small, rural, up to medium-sized community hospitals, large medical groups, that aren't the large multi-hospital systems and academic medical centers that are very highly resourced. Because the lesser resourced organizations are ones in which the leadership are least likely to be looking for a solution like yours, and most likely to be doubtful of the positive outcome. What would you say to those folks in terms of going in and really doing the network segmentation they need to do?
Yeah, I would say that instead of approaching it from the VLAN perspective, approach it from the application perspective. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
The second thing is, I would look at it like, well, I'm a small organization. I don't have a lot of money and resources. Maybe I can't afford the big dog or the big giant, that's out there. But you also have to take a look at, who are my staff, who are my resources. Think of more like a platform type of approach, where if I have a vendor that can actually give me that software-defined networking type of feel, and it can help me with microsegmentation at the same time, all the better. If you can use what you have that's existing.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that to me, finding out that only 25% of our readers had done any segmentation is just, I wasn't surprised, but I was discouraged to hear that, because that is a low number, as we discussed. How does segmentation also, how do the various forms of security support each other? So audits of backups, frequent backups, especially if you or EHR. And as I say, auditing the backups, doing behavioral monitoring. You may need a security operations center, a SOC. When you put all those things together, doesn't everything really reinforce everything else?
Yes, sure, yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Okay.
Take a little drink.
Sure. So how will the landscape evolve forward in the next few years around all of this? What will happen?
Well, I think the ransomware landscape is just going to get worse. There'll be more attacks. The ransomware will get more complex.
Or sophisticated?
Definitely more sophisticated. And I think you'll start to see, like, I know we've had some recent ones, the meat company, we had Colonial Pipeline. I think attacks on infrastructure too will increase, but healthcare isn't going away because they know that that's where the money is right now.
Right. Well, and if you go after a freestanding independent community hospital that's 250 beds, there's a good chance they're not as sophisticated as they should be.
Correct. That is true.
You can make a good guess. I think that the other element here is often that kind of facility will not have a CISO yet. Or they may have designated someone as a CISO who's really still just Bob, right? Like some of the time, you're a CISO. It reminds me a little bit, in fact, of how the first data managers were designated to be CIOs in the early 1990s. And some of them were kind of like, oh, that's so nice. What's a CIO, right? Like, now you're a space explorer. And part of the challenge there, I think, is when you or your colleagues come in to speak with the C-suite, sometimes there isn't even anyone there who completely understands what the pitch is, what you're talking about. And that's hard then. It's hard to convey the danger. And also the other factor I think that's involved is so often cybersecurity funding is seen as a loss center, right? Rather than investment.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? I mean, obviously it's
Sure,
just like, states require people to have auto insurance so they can drive, right? Why shouldn't we do this?
Right. So unfortunately, security falls under the IT umbrella in a lot of organizations, and IT is considered a cost center. And from the CIO's perspective, they just want to save on costs. And the CISO's perspective, I need to secure my network. Unfortunately, securing your network is going to cost some resources, not just in people, but in product platform too, because you have to supplement what you have. Yeah. If you're a small organization, you can take a look at what you have and look at your existing vendors. Can you get anything more out of what they've given you? That's the first thing I would do. You want to make your money go further. So is there something they have that I can just enable really quickly? It isn't going to cost me a lot to give me like another layer. But at some point, your security has to mature, and you're going to have to start thinking about different ways. Other vendors, there are a lot of vendors out there that have expertise in this area that you'll have to start looking into.
Yeah, exactly. I think I want to say something optimistic, and I hope it's optimistic and realistic both. One of the things that is coming out of all these terrible attacks I would say, compared to 3 or 4 years ago, there is a much higher level of awareness now,
Yes, definitely.
including across the C-suite, right? So you're no longer just Chicken Little out there, right? Saying the sky is falling. As more and more attacks happen and they're more spectacular, people are waking up. I will say one nice thing about the US healthcare system, which is we're actually ahead of Europe. Um, I wrote a couple of stories. There was a case in Germany where a death actually was attributed to a
Yes.
yeah, you remember that
Yeah,
story.
I remember that. And there's been other stories like that in the US where ransomware has shut down the hospital, so they have to take patients and move them elsewhere, which could
Exactly.
be 20 miles away, and maybe the patient's in such a critical state, they
Actually die.
they actually pass away because they can't get to the hospital in time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I wrote a story about a month ago about there were attacks on 3 hospital systems in France in completely different areas, very
Mhm.
far from each other. One was in the southwest, one was in the northeast, one was in the northwest. And that finally caused the government there to invest heavily in this. And they agreed to invest 1 billion euros in a
Yeah.
national system. So they're starting to get it, you know.
Yeah, I think I'll be honest with you. I think SolarWinds attack back in December,
Yeah,
I think really brought the whole ransomware more public facing now. I think people are really starting to kind of wake up to the fact that ransomware is real, because that's a perfect example of a supply chain attack. And that's going to happen in healthcare too.
yeah,
Supply chain
yeah.
attacks happen across all industries. If
Right.
you've got a third party that isn't properly secured and they have access in some way, whether it's a third party contractor or a third party tool,
Yeah,
um, you're vulnerable
yeah,
in that
absolutely.
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about SolarWinds. It was so dramatic. And then I also think that the Colonial Pipeline and then the meat plant really shook people up in this country because,
It's our food supply.
yeah, yeah, for several days you had people who couldn't get gas in the Southeast. And then
Right.
no one wants anyone to touch our meat supply in this country.
No, no, no.
Meat is pretty sacred
Definitely.
in the United States. But you're right. It shows how vulnerable everything is. And, it even leads to the the federal policy level. One of the things they're talking about in Congress with the infrastructure talks is really doing something about the grid, the overall grid,
Yeah.
power and everything else related to security. So let's conclude. Let me ask you to share with our audience a few key pieces of advice. Obviously, you don't know about the individuals who are listening in, who are viewing in, but general advice that they should think about that could help them in the next couple of years in this area.
So you have to think about ransomware. It isn't, you have to understand that you're going to be hit at some point. Everybody will be. There isn't anything out there that's 100% effective. It'd be great to think so, but that's really not the reality today. As long as the human element is there, there's something that's going to happen. So you have to be ready for when it comes. So you have to have the proper protections in place.
Yeah.
And it could get past your perimeter based firewall because they often come in over ports that are already open.
Yeah.
It'll get on your endpoint. You should think about your endpoint protection also, because a lot of organizations are still using the traditional signature-based antivirus, which really doesn't work well today. It's like 20-30% effective or lower. So you have to really think about there. And if you do go with the advanced endpoint, at least put it in some type of protect mode. A lot of people install the CrowdStrikes and the Cortexes of the world, but they don't put it in a prevent type of mode. So it's not really helping you a whole lot. But at the same time, traffic does need to move laterally in your organization, and hackers do like to pose as legitimate traffic, because what they're trying to do is scrape your Active Directory password so they can get your privilege escalation so they can move around. You have to stop the moving around. You have to take your certain environments, and we had a question in the chat, and so what exactly is microsegmentation? Is when you segment down to the micro level, and you have to think about it from an application and environment perspective, not VLAN and segment.
Yeah.
Because if you go the VLAN and segment route, you won't really get there. You have to think about, what are my critical environments? What should talk to those and what shouldn't, and lock that down right away. Reduce your attack surface as much as possible, quickly as possible. So that in the event of an attack, if it does spread, it doesn't spread that much, and you can recover from it easily.
Exactly. Wonderful. Any last thoughts, Heather?
So like I said, so with microsegmentation, think about it from an application perspective, not VLAN and segment. If you've got an existing vendors, you can't really do it with hardware firewalls. You can't really microsegment with hardware firewalls. It's great to think so, but it's extremely expensive and it doesn't scale well. You need some type of software-defined service. And with microsegmentation on Nutanix, if you're already running Nutanix AHV, you can just enable it and start right away, protecting your internal applications.
That's wonderful. And I'll just say, I think for any of our audience who are viewing, it's so obvious to me that this has to be a part of an overall strategy.
Yes, it does. Yep.
Yeah, I knew you'd agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So often in this area, as in every other area that touches on technology, it's like, oh, well, we just heard that the people in the hospital down the street did this, so we need to do it, as opposed to think about what it is you want to do for your organization.
Right. Yeah, a lot of industries are always like, well, what is the other place doing? What is my friend doing? You know, it's great to always kind of think about what other people are doing, what other people are using, but what other people are using may not work for you. So you have to kind of think of yourself, what's going to work in my organization? I already have certain tools in place. They have ransomware capabilities. I'm going to use those. You can't really rely on what other people are doing. It's great for research purposes, but again, you have to think about what's going to work in my organization.
Right.
Works for one, might not the other.
Right. And connect it to your strategy. What are you trying to do?
Exactly. You have to have a strategy around it. And it would be great if, you know, companies could start thinking about, how do I protect that east-west lateral movement? Because it will reduce your attack surface. And so if you do get hit, because you will, unfortunately, that's just the way of the world, it can really be your final decision between whether or not I have a very large cleanup or a very small one.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to restate something that you stated, which I completely agree with, which is things are going to get worse, unfortunately. Yeah. The bad guys, as soon as the industry begins to really catch up with a particular tactic or a particular type of attack, and as soon as we begin to learn it, they think of a new one. And we're just going to have to accept that that's the reality going forward. And I'm so glad you brought up SolarWinds, because that was a great example of where that we need to look at these big attacks that are affecting us. So Matt has returned.
Hello,
to help us out. So thank you so much, Heather. This has been such a great conversation. We really
appreciate it. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll echo that. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Heather. Thank you both for that fireside chat. It was great. Okay, now we are going to take another short break, and we will gather back here at 12:45 Eastern Time for our next session, which will be a presentation entitled "The HIPAA Problem You Didn't Know You Had and How to Fix It." We look forward to seeing you all back on here at 12:45 sharp. Thank you very much. Take care.